How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Was lost, yeah, but right now I'm found. 'Twas blind, hey, was blind, said I was oh, but right now I see.
The 18th century for the Westover family is marked by the good works of brothers carrying the Westover name. How they cared for each other and influenced each other would take their descendants in ever new directions. Like their forefathers, events out of their control would also have a profound influence on their fate. The quick passing of Jonas Jr. and Abigail Westover left 5 children, ages 3 to 12, with an uncertain future in 1714. Existing wills from these parents clearly left charge of the family to the uncles, 2 from the Case side, and 1, Jonathan, who was Jonas Jr.'s little brother, from the Westover side. In 1714, Uncle Jonathan was about 40 years old. His path seemed to mirror that of his brother. Like Jonas Jr., he carried the title of captain, and like Jonas Jr., he was unmarried for a long time without a family of his own. As the surviving male heir to both his father and his brother, Uncle Jonathan not only instantly became the adoptive parents to his young nieces and nephews, he also became a large landowner and a man of substantial means. There is no doubt that this single man became the head of the Westover family. When his sister Mary was suddenly widowed, it was Jonathan who took her in. When young Sarah, his niece, died in 1718, it was Uncle Jonathan who took care of the arrangements. In later years, after his sister remarried and was widowed yet again, this time with 3 children, it was brother Jonathan who assumed responsibility. Jonathan was also on record for taking 2 orphan children from a neighbor who had suddenly passed away. As a man of means with a lot of children under his charge, Jonathan looked north and west with a group of investors to just over the Massachusetts border. He was part of a group that organized the area that would eventually come to be known as Sheffield, Massachusetts. By this time, Jonathan had married a young bride and also started a young family of his own. With all these responsibilities, Jonathan set to work in establishing an all-new Westover family homestead in Sheffield. There, Jonathan claimed 250 acres, and so too was claimed 250 acres for the children of widow Westover. We assume this covers not only the children of his sister, but also of his brother Jonas Jr., who were just starting now to come of age. It would be the boys of Jonas Jr. who would flourish in this place. These brothers were named Nathaniel, Jonah, and John. Within their families, more than 30 children would be raised in Sheffield. Nathaniel, the oldest of the 3, would raise his large family in a home that doubled as a tavern. He would become prominent in the community of Sheffield, serving on the town council, surveying roads, building schools, and establishing such a name for himself that he would come to be portrayed in local plays about town history more than 2 centuries later. Jonah and John would likewise make a mark on the community. These brothers would live with each other and raise their families together. Together they built and resided in this home, a building that still stands today and is known as the Westover Bacon Potts Farm on the National Historic Register. It is also known as the Jonah Westover House. Jonah married Deborah Eno, another settler who hailed from Simsbury, with a family name well chronicled in the early history of Puritan New England life. They had a large family with at least 10 children. His descendants would ultimately migrate south into New York State. John also married a Simsbury girl. Her name was Rachel Morton, and together they would raise about 13 children, most of them with very biblical names such as Job, Noah, Moses, and Amos. This is a very important clue because it points to the ongoing influence of religion in the lives of the Westover family. John was just 3 years old when his parents died. You have to wonder where this influence for him came from. By all rights, it appears Uncle Jonathan Westover was the guiding light. As a principal investor in Sheffield, he had influence in seeing that the community was set up with a church and a minister. Unlike Simsbury, however, which was much more of an extension of Puritan Windsor, the new community of Sheffield was more diverse, with Dutch settlers more mingled with those of Puritan stock. There were great divisions on topics of doctrine, law, salvation, and prickly issues such as slavery. One of the first ministers to the area was a strict Calvinist. He took a dim view on the people of Sheffield, saying they lived without concern for religion and were given to many vices. His approach bristled the settlers of Sheffield, which led to low attendance at church, a somewhat dangerous practice even in post-Puritan times. The church had many critics. John Westover and his family were not among them. In fact, as the church was reorganized in the 1760s in an attempt to quell the divisions, John was appointed clerk, a position that was recognized with no small degree of importance. Being described by the church leadership as a good and pious man, John had authority to gather the people and lead them from the Book of Common Prayers. Ironically, the congregation in Sheffield was then recognized as fully affiliated with the Church of England, a fact that might have shocked John's forefathers from just a century before. With the family well situated and himself esteemed in the community, as the years of the American Revolution approached, John stayed focused on his loyalties to the church. Living in southern Massachusetts gave them a center seat to the growing rebellion around them, and John and Rachel's 6 surviving sons, as well as their many male cousins, were all coming of age as the debates raged and the battles began. Sheffield was a place of strategic importance during the Revolution and a thoroughfare running between Boston and Albany. It became a place for storing military provisions and frequent army activity. Nathaniel's Inn was frequently a place for meeting and a temporary military headquarters. Given the prominence of the Westover name in the community, the family was naturally subject to community opinions. The big question within the family at home was which side to choose, and many of the Westovers did not share the rebellious spirit of their colonial neighbors. That could have been largely influenced by John Westover. Nathaniel had died in 1755, and brother Jonah followed in 1768, leaving the pious John Westover, clerk of the Church of England in Sheffield, as family patriarch. John, wanting no part of the Revolution, was clearly a loyalist with his connections in the church. He greatly influenced one of his older boys, Job. In a public setting, Job declared that the English Parliament had a right to tax the colonies and said things unflattering about the American Congress. These actions got him hauled before a committee, where he was declared an enemy to American liberty, and all were advised to break off dealings with him. These actions greatly upset the family, and the pressure on them was great, but son Moses, Noah, John, and yes, even Job, all served on the side of the colonies during the long conflict. When it was over and American independence was secured, all was not well in Sheffield nor in the Westover home. As in communities all over New England, those who had proclaimed loyalty to the crown suffered greatly at the hands of their rebel neighbors. Feeling that they needed to flee for their lives, Moses and his brother John took off for Canada, where loyalists were being rewarded with land grants. Noah headed south to New York, where in later years he raised a family and was active in the political affairs of the town of Chatham. Job headed west before finally settling and making a name for himself and his large family in Missouri. Lost in the shuffle of all this dramatic history is youngest son Amos. Amos was old enough to fight in the Revolution, but he never did. Where he was, what he was doing, and more importantly how he felt about it all appears lost to history. What we do know about Amos is that he fell in love. He married Ruth Loomis, another from a long line of Simsbury girls the Westover boys would marry. Their first child arrived in 1778 in Sheffield, so it is safe to assume that Amos was just otherwise occupied compared to his politically active brothers. He appears to have sat out the war in Sheffield. Perhaps he cared for the homestead for his aging parents, given that John would pass away in 1784. Amos wasn't clear what the future would hold for him. Years after the Revolution, he showed up in eastern Canada near his brothers, where he too petitioned the crown for a land grant. When it finally came through for him in 1792, it was tiny compared to his brothers, and evidently not worth his time. By this point, Amos and Ruth had several children, and they hit the road, looking for opportunity on the American frontier and land where they could settle as a family. For a period of about 20 years, it appears the family of Amos and Ruth were in transit, moving from Canada to Vermont, then back to Sheffield, before finally heading out for yet another frontier, this time in Ohio. Records show the Westovers made it to the Ohio frontier in 1815. Amos and Ruth had several adult children by this point, so it isn't clear how many of them were still with them as the new homestead was established. 3 of their youngest children would leave lasting records. Daughter Olive, born in 1790, married Daniel Beale, brother to our own Electa Beale. They would marry in Massachusetts, suggesting that the Beales and the Westovers were well acquainted with each other in New England long before they all ended up in Ohio. Amos Loomis Westover was born in 1803 and stayed in Ohio and raised a large family that mostly remained in the American Midwest. And Alexander Westover, about 17 years of age when Amos and Ruth arrived in Ohio, clearly took a leading role in helping to establish the Westover farm in Ohio. But by 1822 he was alone when he first lost his mother Ruth in the fall of 1821, and then, just a few weeks later, Father Amos passed away. Alexander wandered a bit around Ohio trying to find the right place to stake his claim. He took Electa Beale to wife in 1824, and together they laid down roots in the town of Goshen. Life in central Ohio was rough, just as the pioneer ancestors in Massachusetts and Connecticut had found life in generations before, and how their children and grandchildren would find it in the American West years later. Alexander had to clear the wooded land, build a cabin, and commence the work of farming, no small task with a wife and 3 boys to feed. But something went terribly wrong. We lack the details, but we know the bigger picture. Alexander was sick for a long time and finally died, while yet a very young man at the age of 36, leaving his family destitute. Before he passed, he told his family of a dream he had in which he saw people being baptized by immersion. This was evidently not a normal behavior for Alexander, yet Electa made sure his dream would be remembered years later. Death once again would influence the future generations of the Westover family, and just as it had more than 100 years before, it would push the family further west. 3 generations of Westover brothers, from Jonas Jr. and Jonathan in Simsbury, to John and Jonah in Sheffield, to Amos and his many brothers of the Revolutionary generation, combined to make family history. The story of Westover brothers would now write a whole new chapter. Brothers Edwin, Charles, and Oscar Westover, the sons of Alexander and Electa, would experience a different level of pioneering and a return to religious faith in the Westover family. Join us at westoverfamilyhistory.org as we explore the roots of these pioneering generations and those that followed with the Westover name.